legislation for the record.
Without objection.
Our bill ensures our preparedness and response capabilities will include a robust pipeline of medical countermeasures as it reauthorizes and increases funding for the BioShield Special Reserve Fund and BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. The development of medical countermeasures is a lengthy and often risky endeavor, which is why sending a clear signal that BARDA remains a strong and committed partner with academic institutions and particularly the private sectors in these efforts is so important. The development of vaccines of drugs is a challenging process. Although naturally occurring smallpox has been eradicated around the globe, at least 2 labs, including one in Russia, have live samples of the virus that could be weaponized. But thanks to PAPA, 21st Century Cures, we're more prepared for these kinds of threats. Last Friday, the FDA approved the first drug to treat smallpox. It's called TPOXX. TPOXX is not the only recent approval by the FDA. Days before, on July 10th, the FDA approved an auto-injector which provides a one-time dose of an antidote to block defects of nerve agent, which we've heard about lately. In an effort to ensure we're better prepared when we face an outbreak like Zika or Ebola, PAPA improves the existing Emergency Response Fund so that the Secretary doesn't have to wait on approval from Congress to immediately fund response measures needed to counteract an outbreak. After the devastating hurricanes in Florida and Puerto Rico, we know we need to do better to prioritize the needs of everyone in our community, vulnerable populations, children, senior citizens, people with disabilities. Our bill reauthorizes advisory committees and creates new committees to ensure the needs of seniors and people with disabilities. Our bill also ensures that more health care professionals, nurses, doctors, and others can be hired and trained when facing a public health crisis. We also strengthen the National Disaster Medical System, and we ensure that we have a robust supply of vaccines, equipment, basic like gloves, hazmat suits, masks, and others in our strategic national stockpiles located all across the country, so our professionals have the equipment they need. As a committee, we've heard a lot about the important role of diagnostics, particular point-of-care diagnostics. And Mr. Chairman, as we move forward, I ask the committee to continue to consider ways to utilize diagnostics in a more meaningful way in order to identify infectious diseases and prevent antimicrobial resistance. I can't emphasize enough how critically important it is that we reauthorize PAPA before it expires at the end of September. We have a duty as members of Congress to keep Americans safe and secure. This bill, I believe, is an essential component of accomplishing that goal. I want to thank everyone, especially our staffs, for your incredibly hard work. I look forward to continuing this work as we get this bill to the President's desk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for her comments and for her and Ms. Eshu's really hard work on this. Before we proceed, I'm going to exercise the authority of the chair and introduce our newest staff person who's at the table, Elizabeth Carroll, daughter of Jeff Carroll. Elizabeth, thank you. You're doing a wonderful job. Appreciate your distributing the manager's amendment, and I'm sure your father's going to treat you to ice cream later today. Among other things. How am I doing? We'll now go to Ms. Eshu for 5 minutes to speak on the manager's amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I'm so pleased that our bipartisan legislation with Congresswoman Brooks is being marked up today. It reauthorizes, as she said, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act. We call it PAPA, and I'm so proud to have worked closely with Congresswoman Brooks. I've said it before, I'll say it again, I could not have asked for a better partner. She is a thoroughbred legislator and a true pleasure to work with. I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, that you have helped to shepherd this through, to keep the commitment, as you said, that it was must-pass legislation together with our ranking member. So I thank you for making sure that we reach this day. As you all know, in 2001, our nation endured the horrific attacks on September 11th and the anthrax attacks that followed shortly thereafter. Congress realized that our country was not prepared to coordinate responses to mass casualty events or chemical attacks. So it is, I think, a rarity that our committee is taking up legislation, reauthorizing legislation that actually has a great deal to do with our national security, but this bill does. In 2006, I wrote legislation with then Representative Richard Burr, who was a member of this committee, to address these shortfalls. That important bipartisan legislation, PAPA, was signed into law the same year. Events over the past few years, including Zika, the reemergence of Ebola, and the constant looming threat of a biological attack by another nation or hostile non-state enemies, something that has grown as well, unfortunately, underscore the real threats our country continues to face. In 2017, our nation experienced the most destructive hurricane season in recent memory, followed quickly by the most deadly flu season in decades. Our experience with each of these reminded us that our country is not yet adequately prepared to deal with potentially devastating, widespread public health crises, and that's why this legislation is so critical. PAPA makes changes to the original legislation to direct federal agencies to respond to new and emerging threats, and it threatens our nation's existing preparedness and response programs. This is bringing the challenges to the legislation to meet the challenges that we know face us today and in the future. The legislation provides the authorization and federal resources to invest in programs related to pandemic influenza and emerging infectious diseases, while allowing BARDA, which has really been very, very successful, to maintain its nimble and flexible framework. This is the agency that actually makes good on placing the orders for the drugs that are needed to be stockpiled, but where the federal government is the only customer. There's no other market for it, and that's why BARDA is so important. The bill directs BARDA to address antimicrobial resistance, which is critical to our nation's biodefense. If we have a chemical or biological attack that leaves individuals with burns or open wounds, the medical countermeasures that BARDA has developed to treat that attack will be useless if those injured contract secondary antibiotic-resistant infections. So we need to continue, and that's why the forward appropriations are so important, to invest in research and development of the new and novel antibiotics. The bill restores advanced appropriations for Project BioShield Special Reserve Fund, which is very important. And I'm really pleased, and all the members of the committee, I think this should be a source of pride to you as well. We had so many stakeholders that were a part of this, not only from the subcommittee, not only from the full committee on both sides of the aisle, but the Republican conference and the Democratic caucus. And we worked with all of those members who bettered and strengthened the bill with their ideas, many of them born out of the emergencies that they saw firsthand taking place in their congressional districts. So I want to thank all of those stakeholders. The legislation also reauthorizes the National Advisory Committee on Children and Disasters. There is more that I could talk about, but I think my time is up. The last thing I want to say, Mr. Chairman, is the two key staffers in this, Catherine Knowles from Congresswoman Brooks' staff and Rachel Feibel on my staff. Truly, without them, we wouldn't be here today. So bravo to them and to everyone that, thank you. And I yield back.
Gentlelady, I thank you for your work on this. It's great work, and it's really going to save lives. It really is. Now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one thing lacking in the legislation is what Congressman Cardenas and I have been working on is the antimicrobial resistance issue, and i.e. the superbug concern, which is predominant in healthcare. I'm being told we're continuing to move towards consensus, but obviously not enough where it's included in this piece of legislation. So we hope that we can do that. The very basic, simple premise is that if we want to have antimicrobial resistant drugs on the counter when we need it, we have to find a way to pay for it, hoping that we never use them. That's the basic premise. Or we use it in such a small batch that you can't, there's not a return on investment of the research. So that, and I'm proud to have Congressman Cardenas join me in this cause. I also would like to submit for the record some letters in support. I have a letter to me and Congressman Cardenas from the Infectious Diseases Society of America dated June 29th. I have another one dated June 28th from the Antimicrobial Innovation Alliance. And the last one addressed to you and the ranking member, Congressman Pallone, from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And I hope we can encourage our staffs to keep working so when this gets to the floor, this can be included. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With it, I would yield to Dr. Burgess.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And Mr. Chairman, I want to speak just on the underlying bill, not on the manager's amendment. But this bill today demonstrates our committee can get its job done in a bipartisan and timely manner on important public health programs before their expiration. We have other important work remaining, but I think it is worth noting that this reauthorization bill is being delivered on ahead of time. It includes many bipartisan member priorities. I've been working to include the Mission Zero Act, which I authored with Subcommittee Ranking Member Mr. Green of Texas and Representatives Hudson and Castor. This has already passed the House earlier this year with strong bipartisan support. The bill would establish a grant program for military-civilian partnerships in trauma care and allow both sectors to benefit from each other's experience and expertise. The program is intended to address a significant variation in trauma care delivery across the country, while also helping our troops maintain battlefield readiness between periods of active engagement. We've experienced many scientific and technological advances in the last 20 years, and we must be prepared to address potential public health threats from those intent on using these advances against us. The BioWatch program is the domestic early warning system of an aerosolized biologic attack and the cornerstone of the Department of Homeland Security's comprehensive strategy for countering terrorism. According to CRS, the program does not have any clear authorization in statute, and it originated from an executive order in the Bush administration in the wake of 9/11. Since that time, it has been subject to numerous issues and shortfalls, including false alarms. The BioWatch operates in more than 30 jurisdictions, including the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. So I want to thank Representative Brooks and Eshoo for putting the BioWatch language in the reauthorization bill that would codify this vital joint HHS Department of Homeland Security biosurveillance program, and it will help facilitate the exchange of information and technology between agencies and authorized Department of Health and Human Services and DHS to make recommendations to fortify biological threat detection systems and positively impact local public health entities. I look forward to the passage of this bill, and I'll yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
Gentleman yields.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ranking Member Pallone, both of you, for your leadership on this important issue, and also to Ms. Eshoo and Ms. Brooks as longtime leaders of this effort. We don't know when emergencies will happen. We only know that they will. We don't know how they will happen. We only know that they will happen with increasing severity and frequency. Whether it's devastating hurricanes in Puerto Rico and across the South, out-of-control wildfires in California or Oregon, or infectious diseases spreading around the world, we are facing a future of increasingly deadly man-made and natural biological threats. In San Diego, we have experienced severe wildfires and a hepatitis A outbreak just on the heels of one of the deadliest flu seasons people can remember. The 2017-2018 flu season claimed the lives of 341 San Diegans. Just last year, the CDC declared that the Hep A outbreak was one of the deadliest on record. From November 2016 to January 2018, the city estimates that 20 people died from Hep A and 580 people have been infected. Today, we have an opportunity to vote on a bill that authorizes funding to detect, prepare, and respond to public health emergencies with responsible congressional oversight. For years, Congress has not appropriated adequate money for public health emergencies, including the Public Health Emergency Fund. That's why I'm grateful to the committee for having worked with me and my colleagues in the Senate to include the updated Section 205, a provision that will put more than $150 million a year between 2019 and 2023 to CDC to pay for the predictably unpredictable in a responsible and transparent way. Hope that my colleagues will commit to continue working together in a bipartisan way to ensure adequate funding for the Public Health Emergency Fund and other important emergency preparedness and response priorities. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his good work on this legislation. Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record some letters that are in opposition to the Revamp Act.
Without objection, so ordered. Are there members on the Republican side seeking recognition? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to first thank Representative Brooks and, of course, Anna Ashew, who have worked diligently to deliver a bipartisan bill to reflect the priorities of me and my colleagues. Again, true to form, the Energy and Commerce Committee comes through once again. This is an important bill. I was pleased to see three of my priorities reflected in this particular bill. First, direct hire authority for ASPR. Direct hire authority will allow ASPR to fill vacant emergency response positions on disaster medical assistant teams, critical to effective disaster response. Next, a GAO study to assess current mission readiness of ASPR's disaster medical assistance teams to ensure effective emergency response to correct and emerging threats, both natural and man-made. Finally, I was pleased to see children, seniors, and other at-risk patient communities being addressed in this particular bill. I've had the pleasure also of working with the Jack Nicklaus Children's Hospital and FIU, Florida International University, as they develop a novel approach for pediatric medicine delivery during a disaster response. This bill will allow them to continue to innovate and ultimately save lives. Mr. Chairman, this represents a collaborative effort and is something we can all be proud of. Thank you for your leadership in this committee and on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member as well, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition? Gentlelady from Illinois. Ms. Schakowsky recognized for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representatives Ashew and Brooks for their leadership on this bill, as well as Ranking Member Pallone and Chairman Walden. Thank you for working with us all on H.R. 6378, the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act. I'm really proud to have worked with all of you to include two provisions that strengthen our disaster preparedness and response. The first is language from my bill, H.R. 5998, the Secure Act, to reauthorize the Critical Loan Repayment Program for Epidemic Intelligence Service, EIS, officers serving at the Center for Disease Control. That program is crucial to recruiting the very best medical professionals to keep our country safe from biohazards. EIS officers are health professionals who serve on the front lines of public health emergencies as boots on the ground, disease detectives who investigate outbreaks and assist in the response. For example, EIS officers have responded to threats like Ebola, anthrax, SARS, swine and avian flu, smallpox eradication, and provided disaster relief during the 9/11 and Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Katrina. EIS officers are based in public health departments across the country and are ready to serve on the front lines of public health emergencies. They protect Americans and the global community by being deployed more than 200 times every year. Another provision that I am pleased is included in PAPA is one that directly addresses the unique needs of seniors in disasters. The creation of the National Advisory Committee on Seniors and Disasters brings together representatives from the federal agencies, state and local divisions, and experts in medical disaster planning, preparedness, and response to develop strategies that share critical information to help better respond to the needs of older Americans. We know that seniors have distinct considerations when preparing and responding to disasters, medical conditions that require special medical equipment like oxygen tanks, and limited mobility that require wheelchairs or walking aids, as well as limited transportation to leave their home or living centers. Hurricanes Irma and Harvey made it overwhelmingly clear that more needs to be done to prepare and protect seniors during emergencies. When Hurricane Harvey struck, seniors were trapped in a nursing home in Texas with floodwaters up to their waists as their relatives were unable to reach authorities for help. Similarly, after Hurricane Irma, 8 residents at the Hollywood Hills Senior Center in Florida tragically died. The emergency plans in place were just not enough to prevent these unnecessary deaths. We must ensure that emergency plans and guidelines sufficiently protect everyone. With the Advisory Committee on Seniors and Disasters, we can guarantee that a team of experts will provide much-needed information and coordination on the needs of seniors during emergencies. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members seeking recognition. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we vote on the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Advancing Innovation Act of 2018, I would like to thank Congresswoman Brooks, Congresswoman Eshoo, and members of the Health Subcommittee on my proposal that would ensure Americans have access to safe, secure, and sterile medical countermeasures during public health emergencies. Throughout the legislative process, Congressman Barton, Congressman Griffith, Congresswoman Matsui, and I addressed a safety issue related to breakage, cracks, and particles in glass vials that could contaminate drugs contained in them. Since December, the FDA issued 5 glass recalls, and the agency warned both healthcare providers and patients that glass particles and cracks can cause blood clots, sepsis, and other life-threatening events. Our proposal encourages the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response to conduct an evaluation of obstacles to rapid delivery. If the study finds issues that could adversely affect the delivery of the Strategic National Stockpile, like glass failures, the Assistant Secretary would report its findings to Congress. We want to ensure that the Assistant Secretary continues to be effective and benefit through the use of innovative technologies or improved methods. This effort was accomplished in a collaborative and bipartisan spirit. I thank the committee and staff for supporting the study and look forward to working on report language. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time to Congressman Griffith if he would like.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I do want to thank Congressman Collins and along with Committee Representatives Brooks and Eshoo for moving us in the right direction to address the concerns over potential glass breakage with respect to the storage and delivery of medical countermeasures. This is a concern I brought up at the Health Subcommittee hearing, and I appreciate the work on finding a compromise to this issue. I understand we're in a little bit of a squabble over mays and shalls, which lawyers love, but nobody else really understands. But I really appreciate everybody working together to try to get this language taken care of. And with that, I would yield back to Mr. Collins.
Would the gentleman from New York yield?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. I want to add to what Mr. Griffith said. I've been somewhat involved with this and want to compliment Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Pallone for working on this. I think a study is adequate at this time. We'll see what the results of that study are, but I think it, again, shows how the committee can work in a bipartisan way to address an issue that potentially could be very harmful. I'm not saying it would be, but it could be, so I think this study is excellent. And thank Mr. Collins for his leadership on it. And I yield to the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition on the Democratic side. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingell, for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both you and Ranking Member Pallone for your leadership in shepherding this bill to full committee in a collaborative and partisan process that deserves all of our support. And like everybody else here, I really want to thank the authors of this bill, Congresswoman Susan Brooks and Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, for each of their leadership and dedication to reauthorizing critical emergency preparedness programs that will expire later this year. It wouldn't have happened without the girl power. No offense, men, but it's true. The bill before us, H.R. 6378, the Pandemic and All Hazardous Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act of 2018, will make important changes to our public health and medical emergency preparedness and response system in the years ahead. And I was pleased to see several important bipartisan bills included in the final product the committee will vote on today. Included in this bill is a bipartisan legislation that I introduced with Rep. Daniel Webster in the aftermath of several record-setting natural disasters last year. We were all captivated, horrified, and concerned with stories of nursing homes and hospitals that lost power for significant periods of time, which unfortunately resulted in a loss of life. We have to take lessons learned from these historic disasters to ensure that hospitals, nursing homes, and long-term care facilities are fully prepared when disaster strikes. Our provision directs the United States Health and Human Services to engage with the National Academy of Medicine to conduct a comprehensive study into the assessment of future threats impacting emergency preparedness policies and procedures across the healthcare system. This study matters, and it will make a difference as we look to new policies and procedures to improve our preparedness and readiness for future generations. Additionally, an important provision championed by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz that requires health departments to plan for nursing facilities in a similar way that they plan for hospitals is also included in the bill before us today. And I want to thank my colleague from Florida for her leadership on this issue. While this has been a great display of bipartisanship that is keeping with the long tradition of this committee, there is one area I hope we will work on together, which is, as we continue to work on this bill getting signed into law, and that is increasing funding for the hospital preparedness program. The HPP program has received about half the funding it once did. Given the growing threats, it seems that we need to provide more resources, not less. The healthcare system is designated by the Department of Homeland Security as one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and the HPP program is the only federal funding source that supports efforts by the regional healthcare systems to improve preparedness against all threats through grants and coalitions. Robust funding for this program matters. Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to ask for unanimous consent to submit a statement for the record by America's Essential Hospitals in support of increasing funding for the hospital preparedness program. Is that Mr. Chairman, if that's unanimous consent? And then,
without objection.
Thank you. And again, thank you to all my colleagues for their hard work on this vital reauthorization bill. I'm proud to support this important legislation, and I will look forward to us all supporting it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. I believe the gentlelady from Indiana had a unanimous consent request.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the following letters of support into the record: American College of Surgeons, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, California Life Sciences Association, and the Antimicrobial Working Group.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes, if necessary. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Representative Brooks and Eshoo for their willingness to include a grant program in the manager's amendment to study and reduce acquired infections that occur in healthcare settings. This grant program would be awarded to a health system that has extensive experience in treating patients to full recovery from a high-consequence pathogen such as Ebola. The funds would be used to study the reduction of the transmission of healthcare-acquired infections, targeting the spread of disease between doctors, nurses, researchers, food and environmental services, facilities, and healthcare administrators. The goal of this grant is to develop and employ best practices in healthcare settings to prevent the next deadly pandemic and advance the health, safety, and well-being of the people of the United States. I want to thank my colleagues for working to include this language in the manager's amendment to appropriately address the spread of healthcare-acquired infections. I look forward to passing this legislation out of full committee and to the House floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition on the manager's amendment? If not, the question now arises on approving the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 6378 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported, and congratulations to all who worked on that. The chair now calls up H.R. 6351 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 6351, to amend the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 to improve the process by which the Secretary of Energy authorizes the transfer of civilian nuclear commerce technology and assistance and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any time. For what purpose, gentlemen from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized. Strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to briefly touch on this bipartisan H.R. 6531, the Advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act. I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Doyle and Mr. Green specifically, for working with us to strengthen the bill. As the committee is well aware, the Department of Energy plays a critical role in America's civil nuclear industry's engagement in international commerce through the Part 810 permitting process. And it's no secret, Russia and China are using nuclear power projects to build energy dependence and eventually force compliance to their international objectives. And the world is waiting to see how the United States will respond. For instance, Turkey recently broke ground on its first nuclear power plant, which will be built, owned, and operated by Russia. Russia, and increasingly China, will bid for projects with its state-owned nuclear company through a model that finances the construction of nuclear plants, furnishes the trained personnel to run them, and leases them back to the client country. Russia will offer nuclear project debt with better terms than market rates and provide lucrative government-to-government loans that will help to incentivize countries to enter into the Russian nuclear agreements. These types of actions and incentive packages make one thing perfectly clear. These countries see nuclear power as more than just a commercial deal. They see it as a strategic 100-year state-to-state relationship. To further stress this point, Russia's relations with the European Union was strained following Moscow's annexation of Crimea. And as a result, the EU has been trying to reduce its reliance on Russia for energy supply as it imposed economic sanctions on Moscow. But that has not stopped Russia from entering into new nuclear deals with countries in Eastern Europe, as Russia has offered to entirely finance some of those projects. So needless to say, as these state-backed nuclear companies are directly lobbied by its top leaders, many U.S. nuclear companies find it increasingly difficult to compete against government-backed competitors motivated by political goals, not simply profit. That's why the bill before us today is so important. H.R. 6531, the Advancing U.S. Civil Nuclear Competitiveness and Jobs Act, will give our domestic suppliers a fighting chance. It takes a small, targeted, and bipartisan step forward. It will help modernize the regulatory process governing the peaceful use of atomic energy to preserve international leadership and assure that our U.S. nuclear supply companies can compete in an increasingly competitive global marketplace. I'd like to note this bill is the result, as I mentioned earlier, of bipartisan discussions. It incorporates feedback we received from our Democratic colleagues during the subcommittee markup. Most notably, we heard members express concern with the 30-day time frame for subsection 3B, which requires the Secretary of Energy to establish procedures to approve or disapprove a Part 810 authorization following the completion of the interagency review process. In response to those concerns, the introduced bill provides for a 45-day deadline and explicitly states such a time frame begins only after the Department of State receives necessary foreign assurances and after the interagency review process is completed. Importantly, this 45-day time frame does not automatically require the Secretary to issue an authorization, and the information contained in the application must still meet all necessary national security and non-proliferation requirements. In effect, this 45-day timeline is for the very last phase of the specific authorization review process and consists of collecting and combining completed recommendations from internal DOE stakeholders and the interagencies. When Congress amended the Atomic Energy Act in 1954 to provide for the commercial use of nuclear technology, the United States was one of a few countries who had nuclear energy capacity. Today, the United States is no longer the only game in town. This bill acknowledges that fact by building upon the work that DOE has done to improve and reform the Part 810 process under the Obama administration and the first reforms enacted since 1986. Mr. Chairman, as we have discussed in this committee previously, the 810 process must function well for the U.S. to remain competitive within this civil nuclear marketplace. This bill is a step towards achieving that goal, and it's crucial that we separate these common sense policy reforms from politics. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bipartisan bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. For what purpose the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6351, offered by Mr. Pallone.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment dispensed with. Clerks will disperse the amendment and distribute the amendment. And the chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment strikes Section 3B of the bill, which establishes the 45-day time limit for the Secretary to approve the transfer of nuclear technologies to countries that are not nuclear weapon states. The amendment replaces Section 3B with a GAO study reviewing the Part 810 process and analyzing the national security implications of a 45-day time limit proposed in the bill. I sympathize with domestic nuclear manufacturers who desire a more efficient Part 810 review process. However, I have concerns with placing a rigid timeline on the review process. It has become a pattern for committee Republicans to put forward legislation adding a shot clock to important agency review process, whether the subject is natural gas pipeline reviews, hydropower licensing, or LNG export applications. And I think it's bad policy, and in this case, I worry that hasty decisions could result in threats to our national security. This amendment retains the delegation authority in Section 3A, which I still question, but I must also note that it is, in my opinion, ridiculous that we're marking up this bill today while the majority already signed off on similar language being included in the National Defense Authorization Act conference report. We should have only considered this under regular order. The majority should have protected our jurisdiction and objected to armed services, including language in NDAA, especially when the jurisdiction lies solely with this committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. Furthermore, President Trump has abandoned the Iran deal, and now Saudi Arabia has said that if Iran restarts its nuclear program, Saudi Arabia will itself pursue building nuclear weapons. I'm just uncomfortable with expediting the review process for Part 810 at a time when there's so much global uncertainty on nuclear proliferation. So with that, unless someone wants my time, Mr. Engel, sure. I yield to Mr. Engel.
I'm going to keep my remarks brief because, as you can tell, I'm losing my voice. The stated purpose of the legislation before us today is to modernize the Part 810 regulations, which control the flow, of low proliferation risk nuclear reactor technologies to foreign countries. The Department of Energy issued a final rule revising Part 810 in February 2015 and then updated its Part 810 guidance in June 2016. So this is not some regulatory relic of a bygone era. Nonetheless, we want this process to function well so that the U.S. remains competitive in the commercial nuclear space. Section 3 of the bill institutes an expedited approval process, would establish a 45-day time limit for the Secretary to approve the transfer of nuclear technologies to countries that are not nuclear weapon states. Excuse me. I'm concerned about the need for and the implications of imposing a rigid timeline on the review process, because this issue is too important to get wrong. So I fully support Mr. Pallone's amendment to have the GAO review the Part 810 process and analyze the national security implication of the 45-day time limit proposed by the bill. I yield back.
I mean, there's a minute. Does anybody want the time? Yeah, go ahead.
I thank the chair and the ranking member for calling attention to H.R. 6351. There are two aspects of this bill that I want to talk about. First, increasing the processing time for license applications under Part 810, and second, delegation of Secretary of Energy's authority for certain authorizations. Regarding the processing time, U.S. companies do need to be competitive to supply nuclear energy technologies around the world. Giving companies certainty about length of time is important. Further, the Secretary should not be required to give his personal signature for all parts of 810 actions, especially if these do not involve enrichment or reprocessing. These are good ideas or common sense. However, I have concerns over this administration's nuclear posture. This president's actions with Russia, its destabilization of the Middle East, and its red herring diplomacy for North Korea are most concerning. These actions do not give me confidence that this is an appropriate time to move forward with these measures. For that reason, I support the Pallone amendment, and I remain opposed to the underlying bill. I yield back.
And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Chair recognizes himself to speak against the amendment. This amendment strikes Section 3B and requires the Comptroller General to submit a report on to Congress on DOE's Part 810 approval process. In 2014, at the request of then Chairman Fred Upton, Government Accountability Office studied DOE's Part 810 approval process and subsequently submitted a report titled Additional Actions Needed to Improve Department of Energy's Export Control Process. The GAO stated, and I quote, encouraging U.S. exports of civilian nuclear products, services, and technology while ensuring they're not used for foreign nuclear weapons programs is a fundamental goal of U.S. policy, close quote. The GAO report found DOE, quote, consistently missed its 30-day targets for initial and interagency stages of the Part 810 review process, close quote, and documented that 86 of 89 reviews exceeded the time to complete the review process. So partially in response to this report, the Department of Energy, under the leadership of Secretary Moniz, updated the Part 810 authorization process and issued a final rule in March of 2015. Now, that final rule included an update of technology in 810.2, which Mr. Pallone's amendment would study. If the list should be updated barely 3 years after the completion of the previous review. So on July 10th, 11 non-proliferation experts sent a letter to the chairman and ranking members of the Armed Services Committee in support of delegating certain Part 810 authorizations. The signatures, which include several who previously were involved in the Part 810 licensee's decision, state, and I quote, we do not think it's a good use of the Secretary of Energy's time to require his or her signature for every action under Part 810. Requiring a secretarial signature for all Part 810 actions adds substantial time to the license application process with disproportionately little benefit. Permitting delegation of actions under Part 810 would allow the Secretary of Energy to focus his or her time on higher priority issues, would be a better use of the taxpayer resources, and would significantly reduce regulatory burden on the U.S. industry without sacrificing national security interests, close quote. That, again, is from 11 non-proliferation experts. This issue does not need further study. We have the information and we have the data to advance this policy, and it is clear that our foreign adversaries are acting, not studying how to dominate global nuclear energy markets. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Are there any other members on our side seeking time? I can yield the remaining 2 minutes to Mr. Johnson of Ohio. Are you moving to?
Chairman, I
no.
strike
I'm yielding my 2 minutes to you if you want to
No,
speak on that. Okay. Otherwise, I will turn to balance my time and recognize
Mr. Chairman.
Rush. The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment strikes the controversial expedited procedures section from the bill and inserts a GAO study that will evaluate the Part 810 process, including whether putting a time limit on these reviews will jeopardize national security. I believe we need to study this issue, Mr. Chairman, in more detail before we decide to give the Trump administration a more streamlined process in an area where national security could be at risk. It appears that DOE can improve this process on its own without congressional involvement. DOE testified at the legislative hearing on this bill that it has made numerous improvements to the process through its 810 process improvement plan. Further, Mr. Chairman, DOE testified that, and I quote, the lengthiest part of the authorization process remains the time it takes partner countries to provide the required governmental non-proliferation assurances, which can result in processing delays of 6 months to well over a year. So, Mr. Chairman, I am not opposed to making the 810 process more efficient, but I think we need to make sure that we have all the facts before we place a rigid review timeline in statute. And Mr. Chairman, I have some time remaining. If there's no one want to use the time, then I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there members on the Republican side seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word. Before we wrap up discussion on this amendment and vote, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to submit the following letters of support for the record. A letter from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers to members of the Energy and Commerce Committee in support of H.R. 6351. A letter from the President of the American Nuclear Society in support of the bill. A letter to Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Pallone supporting H.R. 6351 from Clear Path Action. A letter from Maria Korsnick, the CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, supporting the legislation. A letter from David Blee, President of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council, in support of H.R. 6351. And a letter to Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Pallone from Dr. Ashley Finan, the Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, in support of H.R. 6351. And unless anyone...
Without objection, they'll be entered in the record. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. There are other members seeking recognition. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in favor of this bill. I have heard from several companies in my district who are experiencing issues with the 810 process. Companies have had pending applications for over 400 days to export low-risk technologies like water pumps, waiting 400 days just to get permission to send interns overseas. The uncertainty in this process threatens American manufacturing jobs and America's ability to compete internationally. I want to thank Mr. Johnson for working with me to improve this common sense legislation. This bill makes targeted and modest adjustments for exports of low-risk technology to low-risk countries. In the event that the Secretary determines that a technology poses a national security risk or a foreign country's intent is hostile to the interest of the United States, that technology or country would not be eligible under this bill. This legislation makes reasonable, minor, and widely supported clarifications to the export process by allowing agencies to conduct parallel processing of applications and giving the Secretary the option to delegate final approval for low-risk technology and reauthorizations. The U.S. will be able to provide more certainty to companies seeking to export. Since the subcommittee hearing, we have extended the timeline from 30 to 45 days for the Secretary of DOE to give final sign-off on an application. The bill also clarified that this timeline only starts at the end of the process after the State Department has provided their foreign assurances and an interagency review has occurred to thoroughly vet the application. Further, the DOE vets any application before it even reaches the interagency phase. This will provide ample time for the DOE to come to a determination before that timeline even starts. This bill is widely supported by industry, labor, and energy groups. I have a letter of support signed by former administration officials who served under the Obama, Bush, and Clinton administrations, including a former chairman and commissioner of the NRC, former director of Oak Ridge and Pacific Northwest National Labs, former Deputy Secretary of Energy, and others. We also have a letter from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers outlining the importance of exports for manufacturing jobs. Third Way has also supported this bill, as has the American Nuclear Society, the Nuclear Energy Institute, and the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit those letters of support for the record.
Without objection.
Now, I agree with my colleagues that national security is of the utmost concern, particularly under this current administration. It is for that reason that it is so important that the United States has a role in the international arena. If the U.S. is unable to export nuclear technology, that void instead will be filled by countries like Russia, who are not our ally. Nuclear reactors have a 100-year lifespan. That's 100 years of engagement with American businesses and safe American technologies on the ground in other countries. The United States needs to be more engaged internationally, not less, if we are ever going to achieve our nuclear nonproliferation goals. If we lose our domestic supply chain and become dependent on foreign suppliers, then our domestic manufacturers will suffer and our national security will be worse off. This is a good bill. This is a common sense bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, the question now arises on the amendment. Those in favor vote aye. Those opposed, no. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Miss Eshoo. Miss Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Daggett? Ms. Daggett votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield? Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor? Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonka? Mr. Tonka votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Ms. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes aye. Chairman Walden? Chairman Walden votes no. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes no.
Are there other members not recorded who wish to be recorded? See none. Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes and 31 noes.
18 ayes, 31 noes. The noes appear to have it. The noes have it, and the amendment's not adopted. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6351, offered by Mr. Hudson.
Without objection, further reading, the amendment's dispensed with, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Walden. Ranking Member Pallone. My amendment prohibits the Secretary from delegating authorizations for activities in Russia and China. While we should be doing everything we can to ensure the United States maintains its competitive position on the global stage, when it comes to nuclear technology, we must be diligent when working with countries who don't share our national interests. Russia and China have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that warrants a close skepticism for any interaction in respective civilian nuclear activities. My amendment simply excludes those two countries from the ability for the Secretary to delegate the Part 810 authorization process. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield to any of my colleagues. See not, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition on the amendment? See none. The question now arises on approval of the Hudson Amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? If not, the question now arises. So close. The gentleman from Illinois, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Strike the last word, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Today we're discussing a bill that would take small steps to increase transparency and predictability for American companies that want to export commercial nuclear power. And as we've been discussing, and for those that don't know, American companies, what they're up against, many of our foreign competitors are state-run entities doing everything they can to get a leg up on international nuclear markets. The reason I wanted to speak, I wanted to show this. I've got a children's book. It's called Nuclear ABCs, which is available at international climate conferences and was specifically intended for South African audiences. Westinghouse, along with companies from our allied countries, France and South Korea, submitted bids to build a new nuclear reactor in South Africa. This book tells the story of nuclear power, how protons and neutrons bond and separate, and it takes the reader on a journey to the home of nuclear, which is Russia. The story tells children about the breathtaking characteristics of Russian nuclear power plants. And if you haven't guessed, this book was created and distributed by Russia's state-owned nuclear company to influence South Africa's decision. And I also have a version right here in Vietnamese, if you're interested too. We've got the technological superiority and the gold standard of safety, but if you think our businesses don't need a more transparent and predictable process when they're up against the propaganda aimed at children, then we have to be careful not to cede our global nuclear leadership to China and Russia. That's all I wanted to say, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield.
The gentleman yield?
Yep. I yield.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding to me.
I would ask unanimous consent to submit a column titled How Russia, China Use Nuclear Reactors to Win Global Influence. It goes through many of the things we've already heard today from those who are proponents of the bill. And I would ask for that unanimous consent.
Without objection?
Mr. Chairman.
Are there other members seeking recognition? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized.
Thank you,
Strike
Mr.
last
Chairman.
word.
I know this is a weighty piece of legislation, but I'd like to recognize some Boy Scouts, a number of them Eagle Scouts from Post 707 in the back watching Democracy today. If you just stand up so we can see. And, Mr. Chairman, you told me you yourself was an Eagle Scout. Congratulations.
Once an Eagle, always an Eagle.
Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations. We're glad to have you all here. So the question now arises on favorably reporting H.R. 6351 as amended to the House. All those in favor will signify by saying aye, those nay, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Ms. Dingell. Ms. Dingell votes no. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye.
Mr. Engel?
Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no.
Are there other members not recorded who wish to be recorded on final passage? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 33 ayes and 16 nays.
33 ayes, 16 nays. The bill as amended is favorably reported to the House. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical conforming changes to the legislation considered by the committee today. So ordered. I want to thank everybody for their good work on these bills, and we stand adjourned.